Let's keep watching those banking numbers, find out what they might tell us about the rest of the industry. Ralph Silva joins me now. Hi, Ralph. It's going to be a record quarter, but how much of this coming, how much is going to be due to reserve releases?
Well, I think from a U.S. perspective, I think I'm very concerned about the banking industry. I think JPMorgan is not going to be representative of the rest of the banks. It turns out that JPMorgan's taken most of the order flow, especially from the institutional side. They seem to be the default provider, but every other bank in the U.S. has been suffering because there's just simply not enough business to go around, and there's just too much capacity in the U.S. right now.
Basically, consumers are cutting credit card use, they're slowing home purchases, so that's a big whack of their business, isn't it?
It is. So it's the revenue side that we're concerned about. They're just not making enough coming in the front door to pay all their expenses, and their expenses are actually increasing. We're expecting 350 to 400 new regulations in the coming 2 years, and the U.S. banks are going to have a real struggle putting that into play. In addition to that, they have the foreclosure litigation that's coming due.
Do we know the costs of all these matters yet or not?
And that's the point, is we really don't. And JPMorgan itself, I think, put in $1.5 billion aside for that, and that's simply not enough. So we're not sure what those costs are going to be, but they're going to be rather significant.
How about trading, investment banking? How's that going to be?
Well, JPMorgan's doing relatively well in the trading area, especially in the debt area, and they're going to continue to do that because they're the default provider of that. But if you look at Bank of America and you look at Citi, we're going to see a 50% reduction in the amount of trading that they've done, and they simply, their capacity is just way beyond that, so the costs are relatively high for them.
As an industry, it's lagging behind the S&P 500. Yes. What's your take? I mean, I think you're saying short-term avoid, but long-term get in.
That's right. I think short-term, I think we're going to see the bottom of the banking industry probably next quarter. This quarter, next quarter, we're going to be relatively flat before we see an uptake. And the reason for that is overcapacity. We just have simply too many banks vying for too little business in the U.S. So we need the business to catch up, and we expect after summer, in the September timeframe, we're going to see the U.S. economy turn around, and the banks are going to be absolutely necessary to get the economy moving.
When you look at JPMorgan versus its peers, is it up there or not?
Oh, it's in a different category.
Yeah.
We used to call Goldman Sachs in this category. They're reaching the Goldman Sachs category where everything they touch turns to gold.
Yeah.
They're in the top 5 banks in the world in this area. They're going to continue to do it. They're in the HSBC area, and they're in the Chinese bank area. They have a lot of capacity. They have relatively good credit, and they're the only American bank that's actually improving their credit losses, whereas the other banks either staying flat or getting worse.
Talk to me about stress tests here in Europe. What do you make of the criteria from the EBA?
I think it's more positive. As we go through this, it's getting more and more positive. To be quite frank, though, we're not going to have a very good stress test until after this crisis has completely finished, because it's fiscally irresponsible to have all your banks fail a stress test. So we're not going to see stress tests that are going to be that stringent, but we're moving in that right direction, which is a positive step.
But isn't it worthless not having stress tests that aren't exactly stringent? It'll be more stringent than last year, though, won't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And every year and every time we do this, they're getting more strict and they're getting tougher to actually pass. But there's going to be 5 to 10% of the banks that are going to fail. And this is their reason to actually increase that amount. So these banks are going to have till the end of the year to fix themselves, which is a very positive thing. But it's going to be hard for them to get money.
A lot was made last year about how regulators didn't keep an eye on what banks are holding on their banking book when it comes to holding sovereign debt to maturity. But it seems today is that regulators will be keeping an eye on banking calculations when it comes to sovereign debt. I mean, that's a big plus, isn't it?
It is a huge plus, but put yourself in the position of the regulators that are thinking about Europe as a whole. If your sovereign debt is all Portuguese debt, you're kind of messing around with the euro here. So this is a double-edged sword. If they actually find out that the banks are heavily leveraged in Spain and Portugal and in Ireland, this actually could turn around and bite them, because it is a dangerous area to be in. If it's sovereign debt from other nations outside of the euro, that's a different thing.
It's been a big week for the banks, of course, especially in the UK. Ralph, 2 days on from the release of Mr. Vickers' report, banks are breathing a huge sigh of relief, do you think?
I would argue quite the opposite. I think they, behind closed doors, are popping champagne bottles. They got away with murder. If there's a winner in the Vickers report, it is by far the banks have won this. There's a little slap on the wrist. It's not a broken arm, or it's certainly not cardiac arrest.
And when it comes to our investment thinking, what do we do when it comes to the UK banks?
I think the UK banks are slightly better positioned than the American banks, but I think the European banks are in actually better position than the UK banks. So if you're going to put your money in banks, I would say the big European banks, the French banks and the German banks, which are doing very, very well.
Yeah.
Long to medium term, the UK, longer term, the US.
Ralph, thanks very much for joining us today. Ralph Silva there from Silva Research Network.